So I think the best thing that introduction illustrates is how often machinery of government changes affect the administration of higher education. But so thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure and privilege to talk to you. A little bit daunting, I have to say, to come after Professor Craven, who usually, in his very insightful way, makes everybody else's presentations entirely superfluous and not particularly interesting. But nevertheless, I'll strive to do my best. And it really is, I think, very instructive that the Universities of Australia has in fact got a higher education compliance and quality network. And I was particularly struck by the very nice way that you've framed today's discussion, and that is quirks of compliance and quest for quality, because I think that puts both of those things in the right sort of balance, certainly as far as we're concerned. So Australia has a new government, and it has a very clear agenda for higher education. Some of you may recall from earlier in the year what the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, then in opposition, said at the Universities Australia conference. As intellectual powerhouses, good universities deserve all the support and encouragement they can reasonably be given, and as much freedom to run their own affairs as can reasonably be managed. And I think that very much sums up my Minister and the current government's views on higher education, and in fact I think goes to some of the issues that Professor Craven was touching on at the end of his presentation just now. So Christopher Pyne too has said emphatically in an interview recently in the ABC, and I quote again, "We will put quality in tertiary education as our number one priority." Further statements by Minister Pyne throw additional light on the government's priorities for the sector, and that is to reduce red tape, to avoid stifling innovation and creativity, and to restore international education as an export industry. The Minister is also looking at the demand-driven system to ensure that that is also achieving quality. So those are some of the parameters that we're working within and that the Minister has set for us. At the same time, the Prime Minister wants to see quality and access run concurrently, and he says the most important thing is to ensure we maximise access to universities while at the same time maintaining and wherever possible improving the quality. So again, you can see some very consistent themes coming through here around enhancing quality and deregulating where and when we can. I know a few of you will argue over the crucial importance of quality in what is a multi-billion-dollar sector such as Australia's higher education sector. And again, our impact internationally and in the international market, I think, is of particular concern to us when we look at issues of quality. So how we go about achieving that is now the issue. And again, I think Professor Craven said some very pertinent things about what we might need to do now to achieve what we all hope to achieve, and that is a quality university system. It's well understood, certainly by us in the department, that Australian higher education providers and universities, practitioners like yourself, see the current regulatory regime as too much of a burden. The department is acutely aware of the many concerns, among them the high cost of compliance in terms of resources and time. And of course, importantly, going to the objectives of what you, I know, are in your industry for, is the impact on innovation, development, diversity and autonomy. Innovation is particularly important at this point in the history of higher education, when the impact of new forms of delivery, including things like massive open online learning and other new technology, are emerging as powerful influences. We must keep our eye on the real risks emerging with such forces, including the competition in our international markets. The government's made it clear that reducing red tape across the higher education sector is a top priority. Also at the Universities Australia conference, the Prime Minister signalled his intention that a coalition government would take a more hands-off approach with higher education providers, an approach that allows universities to better focus on their core business of teaching and research, an approach that reduces regulation and compliance while it supports and encourages greater autonomy for universities and for other providers. So just over a week ago, when addressing scientists in Canberra at the Prime Minister's Prize for Science dinner, the Prime Minister alluded to this again. He pledged to extend the tenure of National Health and Medical Research Centre and Australian Research Council grants. His reason, he said, was so that our best minds have more time to devote to research and spend less time filling out forms. The allusion to the government's deregulation agenda is not lost on anyone. And Minister Pyne has set the ball rolling on the deregulation agenda. The Minister has restated the government's commitment to quality and is of the firm view that deregulation must not compromise quality. Indeed, he said again, and I will quote him, the coalition government has an obsession with raising standards and lifting student outcomes. As a first important step in the deregulatory agenda, he has given a direction to the CEO of the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Authority. Under this direction, the government has set forward a deregulatory and quality enhancement philosophy. And I think that's important, again, reflecting on Professor Craven's earlier comments. It really is, I think, a philosophy. The philosophy is underpinned by deliberate action to remove red tape. As part of this, the Minister is requiring the Chief Executive Officer of TEXA to consult and seek advice, as well as to focus on improving the timeliness of its regulatory activities and advancing appropriate deregulation for the sector. TEXA will also have to report to the Minister on its progress in achieving these objectives, as well as the cost savings to be delivered. Additionally, he's asked TEXA to consult with the National Advisory Council on Higher Education Data and Information, and I'm not even going to try and put that into an acronym because it's one of the worst around, I think, and to seek advice on how best to reduce red tape from the TEXA Advisory Council, which the government has committed to establishing. So those are the first two steps, concrete steps, that the Minister's wanting to take. First, he issued the direction to TEXA, and I think that goes to the notion of recalibration, again, that Professor Craven was talking about earlier. And secondly, to the notion of establishing an advisory council, which goes to, again, I think, a very important message coming to us, as well as to you through Professor Craven, and that's the need to consult and engage meaningfully with players in universities and higher education. So in a nutshell, the Minister has asked TEXA to simplify its processes and to deliver faster turnaround for providers. These are very much the initial steps by government to implement the recommendations of the Higher Education Regulation Review. Overall, one thing is clear. There is much recognition in government of the concerns of higher education providers and universities. So on the 23rd of October, Minister Pyne endorsed the findings and committed to implementing all 11 recommendations arising from the independent review of higher education regulation. The aim of that report was to explore avenues to reduce the regulatory burden on universities and other providers. Released in August, the report has understandably been well received by the sector. It highlights the need to remove unnecessary and duplicative reporting arrangements, among other recommendations, and also to look at the myriad interactions in our overall regulatory framework and landscape. So Professor Kwong Lee Dow and Professor Valerie Braithwaite undertook the review, and I'm very pleased to see, Kwong, you here today and to share your thoughts with us later. I must say personally it was a great privilege to be able to support the review within the department and to engage with Kwong and Valerie and their deep knowledge of higher education and regulation, and indeed deregulation, as that process unwound. I must say, to be congratulated to both Professor Kwong Lee Dow and Valerie Braithwaite that they managed to do that enormous task in such a very short time. So suffice it to say that the government has now accepted all of the recommendations of the review, and the Minister has indicated to us, and more broadly, that he will vigorously pursue their implementation. You'd also be aware that a review of reporting requirements commissioned by the then Department of Innovation, together with Universities Australia last August, also looked at this very vexed question of reporting burden. That was the Phillips KPA report, and it examined the department's reporting requirements as well as those of TEXA. So there's work to be done within government and within department as a line agency, not just within TEXA. That report told us that Australian universities in 2011 on average spent more than 2,000 days of staff time and up to $900,000 in meeting reporting requirements. And there are other equally devastating statistics around that enumerate the extent of that problem and issue. The review was commissioned because of a genuine commitment to lift that reporting burden on providers. So in fact that report gave rise to the National Advisory Committee that I just spoke of. And the group is now in fact providing much needed assistance in finding solutions to the question of reporting overlap and burden, and is advising the department on ways to develop things like a one-stop shop for higher education data collection and dissemination. But obviously there's room for more. And the Minister is now indeed looking at the report and will respond to it in shortly. For our part, the Department of Education is working to deliver against those objectives. Several aspects of the review recommendations have implications for the department as part of its broader regulatory structure. And as I mentioned earlier, particularly in our role as being responsible for a number of pieces of legislation and the overlaps between those pieces of legislation, such as TEXA, Invetra in the vocational education space, and ESOS in the international student space, I think there is room for us to look at how we work those different responsibilities and requirements together better. Those recommendations seek to reduce regulation duplication and will involve the department working closely not only with TEXA but with other agencies and of course with you and higher education providers more generally. The review also makes mention of areas where collaboration could be enhanced, and I think that's an important message from the report as well. For example, the role of information sharing and policy advisory groups, standard setting agencies and meetings of the regulators between each other and with the department. We like to think we've already made some progress in sharing information with TEXA through the amendments to the Higher Education Support Act amended last year, which reduces the need for TEXA to collect information separately from all of you. And we're looking at what can be done quickly in terms of that review to streamline processes within the department and beyond. The review made 27 recommendations, including developing a national higher education data collection and information repository, expanding the listing and timetable of the department's reporting requirements for universities, removing overlap and duplication between compacts and other instruments of data collection and reporting, rethinking the use of census dates within HEMS to improve the efficiency, flexibility and timeliness of reporting and delivery of information. And those issues are engaging the advisory group as we speak. Of course, the work we do within the broader education portfolio also helps maintain quality in the sector, and it's not simply about deregulation and reporting. We provide funding support for research projects to underpin quality teaching and learning in higher education through the Office of Learning and Teaching. These grants and fellowships go towards projects that explore and help develop new ways of learning and teaching and help develop leadership capabilities. So they go more to the quality enhancement side of the agenda that we've just been talking about. They focus on areas such as curriculum development, internationalisation in university study, and enhancement of learning and teaching through technology. One of the good things about the projects is that they encourage collaboration and the sharing of good practice for improved student learning outcomes. The Learning and Teaching Academic Standards Project is a good example of this. It sought to develop what is called negotiated discipline threshold learning outcomes, and I'm sure, or I hope at least you know more about that than I do. But unlike, generally threshold learning outcomes are quite similar to the graduate attributes or capabilities published by universities. However, unlike the graduate attributes, threshold learning outcomes are discipline specific. A number of disciplines were involved in the project, and there's a range of them. In fact, I think very few appear to have been left out. This project saw experts from these disciplines consult with other members of the national discipline community, accrediting bodies and industry. They benchmarked their findings with the Australian Qualifications Framework and other national and international standards. The result is a set of 5 to 8 concise statements describing the minimum standards that graduates are expected to meet. And even though the project is now complete, work on threshold learning outcomes has continued in many disciplines. For example, the Discipline Scholars Network is supporting work to develop threshold learning outcomes in agriculture and tourism and hospitality. Work is also underway in chemistry, biology and a number of other disciplines. Law and Science have also produced good practice guides to assist in integrating threshold learning outcomes in their curriculum. And we're seeing the usefulness of this project in other areas. At the same time, as I'm sure you're all aware, the Higher Education Standards Panel is considering a range of issues in relation to teaching and learning outcomes, as well as research in a revised higher education standards framework. The panel was established in January 2012 to provide independent advice on making and varying the standards for higher education, and as such is an important part of the current regulatory architecture. We look forward to hearing more from the panel as it finalises its position on these issues, as no doubt you do too. The Australian Government is supporting a step change in the training of pre-service maths and science teachers, with some $14 million being invested in the Enhancing the Training of Maths and Science Teachers program. 5 university consortiums are involved in this project. They're designing new courses that will drive a major improvement in the quality of maths and science teachers. Again, something that is a particular issue and passion indeed of Minister Pyne. The Minister has said the government will restore the focus on science, technology, engineering and maths in primary and secondary schools as part of this agenda. In addition, this year there was a strategic funding priority for projects that can support universities to further develop their online learning, including MOOCs. This is consistent with the Prime Minister's commitment to see Australian universities take advantage of the growth of online learning and to foster innovation, a particularly critical toolkit, as I was saying earlier, in terms of the changes universities are facing at the moment. These projects will encourage further dialogue between employers and universities to understand the skills expected of a graduate and identify good practice that can be shared and built on by both sectors. There are, of course, many other examples of best practice and cooperation, but perhaps this morning isn't the time to go through all of those now. So, in concluding, I'd like to emphasise again, and drawing again on a couple of things that Professor Craven mentioned. I think the government is particularly concerned in looking at the whole issue of deregulation within higher education, to make a priority of consultation and close engagement with the sector, and to look at removing regulation and reporting wherever it can. I was intrigued by Professor Craven's suggestion that we could look at drafting legislation to support universities just now, and I think there's an idea which deserves further consideration. One of the things I think, though, that government will ask us is, if you're establishing a new piece of legislation, what piece of legislation is it that you no longer require or don't think is necessary? The deregulation agenda across government is really very, very conscious of this issue of not introducing the new without getting rid of the old. A key government approach to supporting quality is to create the environment that enables institutions to be what they want to be and to do the best they can. Again, that's something that you'll hear coming out, I think, from the Minister and the government more generally, and that is to do the best we can to enable universities to pursue their own goals and missions. So to achieve this, the government has placed deregulation at the top of its higher education agenda. The government wants to see the burden of regulation and reporting on providers reduced. We are, of course, in the Department of Education committed to working with you to achieve that goal. And I might close again with an observation by the Prime Minister. Universities' task is not to work more closely with government, but to do their job as well as they possibly can, to be more effective teachers, more insightful researchers, and more powerful contributors to a more humane society. Higher education is one area where government's role is more to be a respectful listener than a hands-on manager. So I'd like to think at least that today I will have that opportunity to be a very respectful listener, and I look forward to being here with you today. Thank you.
Are there any questions from the floor for Jessie? I think that was an extremely useful speech. Thank you. I learnt a lot from it as well, and I think there must be some questions around this, given that it looks like there'll be less emphasis on regulation in the future.
Thank you very much. Peter McCallum again from the University of Sydney. I don't want to be mischievous, but would you like to comment on how a deregulatory agenda fits with the idea of a government having a view one way or the other on whether universities should charge a student amenity fee?
I'm not in a position to comment on that this morning, I'm afraid. So I think that's a question for another day.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask, there's higher education provision and there's higher education providers. And at the recent TEXA conference, they talked about how there's quite a lot of dual sector providers in higher education. And we've now seen that vocational education and training has been put into a different portfolio. Are you able to comment on the communications between the Minister of Education and the Minister of Industry and what their approach will be in terms of perhaps any inclusion of vocational education and training in this deregulation environment?
Sure. Well, obviously, I'm not in a position to, comment in any detail on the communications between ministers. But let me say that certainly between departments, we're very conscious of the need to continue working together, and we have, in fact, set up processes between the two departments to make sure that we're sharing not only policy agendas but also timetables and so on for how we go about implementing it. And I think particularly the issue for dual sector providers is very sharp, and I guess it's sort of almost, well, not quite sure what the word is for providers working in three areas, but really, as I said earlier, it's that intersection between three pieces of legislation and three quality and regulatory agendas that we need to be conscious of. So we are, and we're working on it.
Are there any other questions? There's one over here. I'll hand you my microphone.
I've just checked HESA on my phone and it's 400 pages long. It's a very complex piece of legislation, intersecting with lots of other pieces of legislation. I just sort of wonder how far do you anticipate the government will go with deregulation in terms of simplifying the existing legislation rather than, as you sort of said before, a zero-sum game, new legislation comes in or out. How detailed is the interest in this kind of thing?
Look, the interest, I think I don't need to tell you, but from even just those few quotes I gave just now, the government is interested in looking at how far it can take deregulation in this sector. It hasn't got a view. I don't think Minister Palm would have a view now as to what parts of the legislation he thinks needs changing, but I don't think he's putting any boundaries around that for us at the moment. Obviously, with the establishment of the advisory group, that will be an important source of advice to him. But I mean, it goes beyond, obviously, the higher education area. The Prime Minister himself, across government, is extremely keen on the whole dereg agenda, and where he can reduce legislative requirements, I'm sure he will.
I'd like to invite you to thank our speaker. Thank you very much. running slightly ahead of time. I think we'll break for morning tea. The next session is going to be chaired by Dr. Brian